Hello, I'm Marilyn Moore. This is the second part of an interview with George H. Smith on the subject of atheism. No. All right, well, let's turn to Nietzsche. You gave me a very short, almost a little poem of a saying here from Nietzsche. Formula of my happiness: a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal.
Yeah. That's another one of those quotations, and again, without even considering Nietzsche's sort of what I consider screwball technical philosophy. It's one of those very good insights, and I think people can relate to that. It kind of relates to Aristotle's view, although he certainly was not an Aristotelian, that, and this is sort of the theory that you shouldn't try to pursue happiness directly. You focus on a goal, and to the extent you succeed, you then you get pleasure, or whatever you wish to call it, happiness from it. Now, Nietzsche was different because he had this will to power idea, and you get into this Overman, or sometimes called the Superman theory, and it gets a little bizarre, but the basic idea there is successful activity, purposeful activity, being very important to a happy life. Now, I should mention that, and Nietzsche talks about this, so does Schopenhauer, and a number of philosophers do, the problem of boredom. In other words, suppose we approach this, and this is my own take, not what either of them say. Suppose that we ask, what is happiness? And we try to answer that question by asking a further question, in contrast to what? In other words, if we're not happy, what are we?
Okay.
And sometimes you can, because happiness is such a broad term, sometimes you can clarify things by wondering what its, in effect, its opposite is. Now, some people say, well, if I'm sad, I'm not happy. Or if I'm in pain, I'm not happy. But some people would say, if I'm bored, I'm not happy. Boredom is that sort of one of those options, or one of those, polar opposites. Now, personally, that's the way I relate to the idea of happiness. I think Schopenhauer once pointed out that basically you've got two personality types. They didn't call them that then, but all these things, all the different personality types. Well, Schopenhauer thought, and he wasn't the only one to think this, that you've got people that avoid discomfort. Mm. They like everything kind of to be in order. They don't like any surprises in their life. They live, let us say, a routine life. Mm-hmm. They're not especially unhappy, but they're not especially happy either. And then he thought there were people, and he thought mainly creative people in whatever field tended to be like this, intellectuals, artists, whatever. Those are the people that can't stand boredom. And they pursue things that might be painful, mm-hmm. might be discomforting, might be upsetting even, but they're interesting. So their goal is not to escape pain per se, or just in the broad sense of unpleasant feelings. It's to escape boredom. And in that escape from boredom, in that pursuit of an interesting life, you might be more than willing to put up with a certain amount of tension in your life. Mm-hmm. And you get into this whole idea, which has been written about from everyone from Arthur Koestler to you name it in the 20th century, about creative tension, creativity, that kind of the soul of the creative artist. And I don't think you're going to find any great many artists in life who were just sort of very laid back, la-di-da people who lived a 9-to-5 life. Uh-huh. Many, not all, but many would be considered highly eccentric in their lifestyles. And that doesn't surprise me in the least, because if you're talking about a genius in some field or another, what is genius in the final analysis except some form of an intellectual eccentricity? Mm-hmm. They're not normal people. They blaze new trails. They don't follow trails set by others. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that a lot of the great geniuses in various fields have not been typical 9-to-5, punch a time clock, go home, and spend an evening watching football. They tend to be, some would say erratic, I would prefer to say eccentric people. Mm-hmm. And so that's my take on that. I resolved, on a personal note, I thought a lot about this in our first interview, the interview with an atheist thing. And I talked about how much I was very introspective and stuff. And my attraction to atheism was, I didn't really think about happiness. I think it made me happier. But my concern was more with truth, like what am I really justified in believing? And I didn't even think about, will it make me happier or not? Nietzsche once made the observation, to digress a second, that he despised Christianity. He considered it a decadent philosophy because it engages in what he called proof by pleasure. It says, in effect, you should believe in Christianity because you'll have eternal happiness in an afterlife. That's like telling a kid, or you should believe something because I'll reward you if you believe it. Not you should believe it because it's true. Not you should believe it because I have evidence. But rather, you're going to get all these goodies if only you believe it. It's kind of the Obama state writ large. Vote for me, and you get all some Republicans like to say, "I get all this free stuff." Well, that's kind of how Nietzsche saw Christianity. God saying, "Look, believe in me, live a good life, and you get all this free stuff in an afterlife, more than you can possibly." I have no idea why I got in this straight.
Well, let me ask you this.
Good. You're going to have to stop me from digressing like that.
I'm going to stop you right there. You mentioned that about when you became an atheist, that you felt happier. And I'm wondering if some of that happiness was from the accomplishment of thinking through.
That's a good point.
And resolving an issue for yourself, and then being able to move on and to act on it.
Yeah, actually that's a good insight. I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but I should qualify and say I think it was experienced more in the form of taking a certain burden off my shoulders in other words, it's resolving a problem that it never quite made sense to you. It's like, all of us probably believe in something, and we kind of are taught it, and it's kind of something we grew up with, but it's never, you don't suppress doubts so much if you just don't deal with them. You don't let them come to the surface, because if doubts come to the surface, especially about a conventional belief that you've held nearly your entire life, well, a couple things happen, and it gets worse as you get older. One thing that happens is you feel like you've wasted a lot of your life. That's why it's difficult to give up. That's one reason it's difficult. There's ego involved in that.
That's interesting.
In other words, if a guy's 60 years old and he's been a devout Christian, and he suddenly decides Christianity is nonsense, what's he going to? He's going to go like that. What was I thinking for 60 years?
For 60 years.
And on the other hand, I think you're right to point out you have that sense of accomplishment, that I did figure this out and I reached a conclusion based on reason, rather than just inertia, mental inertia, going along with what I've been told all these years.
Yeah.
So that's a good point, but I don't want to make it simplistic. I mean, when I was very young, I think I mentioned in the first interview that the idea of a God looking out for me, that was sort of comforting, But I just don't think there's a lot of connection between atheism per se and happiness. But you're right to point out that the natural result of a long train of questioning and doubting and reasoning can be the feeling of self-confidence.
Sure.
The feeling of accomplishment. Because that sort of thing, for anyone who's ever gone through that is an accomplishment.
All right. Well, let's move on to Ayn Rand. You mentioned her earlier, and I think she fits in well right now with what we've just been discussing. I'm going to read a brief passage that you gave me from Atlas Shrugged, and it's from a
Galt's speech. Yeah.
Galt's speech. Happiness is not to be achieved at the command of emotional whims. Happiness is not the satisfaction of whatever irrational wishes you might blindly attempt to indulge. Happiness is a state of non-contradictory joy, a joy without penalty or guilt, a joy that does not clash with any of your values. It does not work for your own destruction, not the joy of escaping from your mind, but of using your mind's fullest power. Not the joy of faking reality, but of achieving values that are real. Not the joy of a drunkard, but of a producer. Happiness is possible only to a rational man, the man who desires nothing but rational goals, seeks nothing but rational values, and finds his joy in nothing but rational actions.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, and you read that very well, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have very mixed feelings about Ayn Rand's theory of happiness. I think there's a lot of intelligent things she says there, and I think her attempt to almost define happiness as a state of non-contradictory joy in itself is amazing. It's pretty tough to come up with any type of definition that makes sense. And what she's obviously getting at there, I believe, is that to hold conflicting beliefs and values will create an internal conflict, and only to the extent that your values and beliefs and so forth don't conflict can you be truly happy. And I think a lot of that passage is devoted to that. Okay, that makes sense, but then we get into this problem that I mentioned earlier about creative tension, and she would say, well, I don't really mean that. I mean conflict of fundamental values. Okay, you can approach this one of two ways. The one, you can sort of take this philosophical, or might even call it a priori approach, sort of reason it out. Or you can kind of go look and see and talk to people who not only say they're happy, but appear to be happy. Now, I don't know how else to explain this except to revert to an old observation in philosophy. I believe it was Voltaire who, in 18th century France, said he was going through the countryside and he saw a peasant woman who was doing something, hanging out laundry or something. And she was humming and seemed very happy and very, very untroubled. And at first he kind of envied her, and then he thought, but would I trade places with her? Because Voltaire was not a happy man, and he admitted this. He was very troubled about a lot of things, kind of a hypochondriac, and he just was, his philosophy kind of made it impossible for him to be happy, let me put it that way. And Voltaire, forgive me if I'm not getting every detail of this correctly, but as I recall, Voltaire asked himself, would I trade places with her? And he said no, because for all of my troubles and internal conflicts, I prefer my relatively unhappy state to her what appears to be happy. Now, John Stuart Mill, the 19th century English philosopher, later made a famous statement very similar to that, where he said something to the effect, it was better to be a man dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Okay. Now, pig here, I don't think he really meant pigs, he meant lower, the same idea, that there are people who don't have a lot of trouble because they don't have a lot of intelligence and inquisitiveness.
Okay.
I remember back in the 70s, there were these therapy groups were very popular. Earhart seminar training, probably, this is something you've never heard of, but very popular.
Est.
Est. And these people would go in and they'd lock them in a big room, and Earhart was a phony name this guy adopted, and they'd come out with this big kind of Stepford Wives smile on their face. Whenever I see these people, they're kind of like this, spooky. It's weird being around them. It's almost like some kind of computer chip was put in their brain. Mm-hmm. Well, they claimed they were just wonderfully happy, and they got happiness however long those things lasted, a weekend or whatever, or a few days, and they sort of almost were attempting to prove it with this sort of plastic smile, if you know what I mean. And there was this kind of creepiness about it. Well, what do we say about people like that? Or what do we say about somebody who doesn't even think about happiness because he's some peasant in the Middle Ages? It doesn't even occur to him because he has to make a living, and to a certain extent, being concerned about happiness is a product of leisure, which is brought about by, I would say capitalism, rise of industrialism, where we have, it doesn't take everyone working 16 hours a day just to make a living. We live off the capital created by others, the technology created by others. That gives us a lot of leisure. Now, leisure here being defined as activities we pursue for their own sake. Work being defined, in sort of Aristotelian tradition, as activities we do in order to support ourselves, things we have to do, more or less, to meet our basic needs. Now, the happiness is often considered to be the result of leisure activity, in the sense that we pursue like certain artistic endeavors. Even the fact we may make money is irrelevant here. We pursue them not for the money, but because of the creative satisfaction we get. Anyway, a lot of people don't have that and have never had the opportunity to have it. Well, does that mean nobody was happy? If I meet, say, somebody of what I consider to be a crazy religion, I won't be too specific, but a crazy denomination that even most Christians think is crazy, and they have a nice family life, they are very nice people, that seem very well adjusted, etc., etc. You can fill in the blanks. Mm-hmm. So what do I say? Certainly those are not rational people with rational values by Rand's standard, mm-hmm. and yet to all intents and purposes they appear genuinely happy. Mm-hmm. So, to go back to my original point, if you take a look and see attitude, this idea that happiness is possible only to rational people doesn't appear to hold up. And that's why I said at the very beginning, I don't associate with atheism or even rigorous rationality with happiness. Okay. And let me just briefly indicate why I think that's so. I think Rand had a point, this idea of non-contradictory joy, mm-hmm. Lack of contradictory values and so forth. But the point is this, it doesn't take objective reality, it takes only what a person subjectively believes. In other words, you can have a really goofball belief system as judged by anyone on the outside, but if it's internally consistent, if it presents a worldview that enables you to make sense of things, even if people think you're nuts and irrational, internally it's a coherent system. Mm-hmm. And that avoids internal conflict. It's just a matter of what you believe. If you can get away with believing it without having reality impinge too much, on you. But some people can pull that off. And I think that really is as much of a key to happiness as anything. The ability to maintain a coherent worldview. Now the question is, to what extent does it matter if that worldview is rational or correct? It helps if it's correct. But I would suggest that to a certain extent, to know a lot about the real world, how things work, tends to work against that kind of complacent view. And I'll end by saying this about Rand's view, and I don't mean to be overly critical of her position, but I think it's way too simple. It's almost a judgment, like you can't really be happy if you don't agree with me, because if you don't agree with me, you're not rational. It's a very pietistic view, almost a Christian view, secularized, that only certain types of people with certain beliefs, or not beliefs per se, but a certain mental attitude can be happy. And I would just say that I'm not even sure how to conclude this with Rand. It ties into a lot of view of human nature and such. But again, I think we have to go back and say, well, so then do we just say, you think you're happy, but you're not really happy if somebody that we don't think is rational claims to be happy? Now, I don't think claiming to be happy is an old philosophical point. If someone says, I'm a very happy person, could they be wrong? I mean, this is the sort of thing philosophers actually talk about. Or, could they might be lying, but assuming they really believe it, can a person be mistaken? If a person said, I feel pleasure right now, and they honestly believe it, can you say, no, you're not really feeling pleasure? Well, if happiness at least depends to a great extent on pleasures, then we have the same problem with happiness. If a person says, I really led a happy life, and they really believe it, can you say, no, you're not rational, so you could not have led a happy life. But anyway, this idea of conflict, the last thing I want to say about Rand is, and this is hard to explain because it sounds a little odd. There's sort of an element, and it's not just Rand, there are other very rationalistic, in the broad sense, philosophers who've held similar views. And the problem is that they almost take a creationist view of human nature, as if God created us perfectly, at least in our original state. And it's only if we mess things up, if we take drugs, for example. That's escapism from reality. That assumes reality is always a great thing, I mean, the real world, so-called. Well, you shouldn't, do this, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that. Well, but if you kind of take a naturalistic evolutionary view, there's no guarantee that every individual is somehow perfectly balanced or perfectly in harmony with nature, such that if you disturb this tranquility, this rational integration with nature, whatever you want to call it, that somehow it's going to hurt them. I think we're kind of a product of accident, not in a literal sense, but metaphysically speaking. We turned out how we are, not because someone designed it that way, it's just through this blind process of spontaneous evolution. Some people turn out differently than others. Some people can do certain things, happiness is not that difficult for them. I've met people, I'm sure you have, whatever they believe, they just seem to be naturally happy people. They just, they're fun to be around, they have a good time, and they're jolly and whatever. And then there are people more like me who are not naturally happy people. We're always kind of fidgeting and bitching about this and that, and always kind of restless and hyper. And if one of those naturally happy people looks at me and says, well, George, you really need to read this book about how to be happy, or you should be more rational. My response to them is just generally, we're different types of people. So don't lecture me, just because on the one hand, you haven't done anything with your life except sit around and be happy. I at least try to do things. I'm being a little...
Well, I mean, you bring up an interesting point, though, because at some point we can only understand ourselves and each other so much, and so at some point we just have to take someone's word for their happiness. I mean, we can't just say you're lying, or that's not true, or we can't judge completely. I mean, we can have our own opinion, but we can't really know. So that's one thing. The other thing is this idea of it being some kind of static state, and that's something that also makes me curious, because it seems to me, while I have met people who seem to have gone through life generally on the same keel. You have any number of people who have these sometimes abrupt changes in their life, or realizations, or just things come tumbling down and they have to make enormous changes in their life. Does that preclude then that any chance for happiness?
Well, again, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. You're exactly right, the early thing you said there, that we tend to judge other people by our own responses. And yet, and he wasn't the only one to do this, but as Herbert Spencer, the 19th century English philosopher and sociologist, pointed out, if you go back in time, if you look at the historical record, and this is sort of commonsensical, you've got early cultures, there's obviously delight in savagery, things that we consider savage today. Warfare, you know, I mean, this gets into the issue also, which is very interesting, is can we compare happiness between different cultures and different times? Can you go back 2,500 years and go to some primitive tribe and, you know, find the happy members of that tribe and say, well, it's the same kind of happiness as, you know, a philosopher or an intellectual or a writer would experience today. But Spencer's point was that the conditions of happiness do change over time, and they're different in different cultures. Now you might say, well, that's kind of a gross relativism or a crude relativism. I'm not an ethical relativist in the sense I think you can have general principles that apply, but they're very general, and the application of them will vary. Okay. So you know, a lot of these sort of sociologists who talk about ethical relativism say, well, different cultures, how can you have any? Well, you can have universal principles. It's just that you have to be very astute and careful about how to apply them.